Hi everybody, welcome to the 10th lesson for Legal Studies 3-4. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the factors which affect Parliament. And to start off with, we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of both houses. So this carries on from the content from the last area study, where we looked at the composition and the roles of the Houses of Parliament. So as you'll remember from the last area study, the main role of the upper house is to act as a house of review, and a subsequent role is to pass legislation. So one factor that affects the ability of the upper house to achieve these purposes is when there is a rubber stamp in the upper house. So looking at the composition of the upper house. So when government holds a majority in both houses, so for example, we have a Labor lower house and a Labor controlled upper house, members will vote along party lines and therefore bills are passed very, very quickly. This is good in achieving the purpose of passing legislation. However, it does not uphold the purpose of acting as a house of review because there's very little debate and scrutiny to the bills proposed by the government. The other factor that affects the ability of the upper house to achieve its purposes is when there is a hostile upper house. So this is where government does not hold a majority in the upper house. So we have a Liberal lower house and a Labor upper house. This means that the upper house will often reject the government's bills and will negotiate significant changes to them. This upholds the purpose of acting as a house of review because a wide range of political opinions are considered and there is increased debate and scrutiny. However, it may restrict Parliament's role of passing legislation as it may stifle lawmaking process. And now looking to the effectiveness of the lower house, remember that the main role of the lower house is to initiate bills, as that is the way that the government can give effect to election promises and fulfill their government agenda. So one factor that affects the effectiveness of the lower house is a majority government. So this is where one political party holds a clear majority of seats in the lower house. And this enhances the effectiveness of the lower house because the lower house can introduce bills which give effect to that political party's election promises and governmental policies. And so it enhances their ability to initiate laws. However, one factor that restricts the ability of the lower house to initiate bills is a minority government. And this is when neither of the major political parties, being the Liberal and Labor Party, hold a majority of seats in the lower house. So instead, those major political parties have to make compromises and form alliances with independents and minor political parties in order to gain a majority vote on the bills that they introduce. This reduces the ability of Parliament to pass legislation as it's a very time-consuming process, and it also reduces the ability of government to pass legislation which gives effect to their political party's policies and governmental agenda. Because if the Labor Party has to make amendments with minor political parties and independents, they may make significant negotiations and amendments to those promises and bills. And so the minor political parties and independents can change the policies in order to gain their support. The next factor which affects the ability of Parliament is representative government. So as I've spoken about before, representative government ensures that all members of Parliament are directly elected by voters, and therefore members of Parliament make laws on behalf of the people. Therefore, politicians have to introduce laws which reflect the community's values and concerns, and that's upheld as per Section 7 and Section 24 of the Constitution. Representative government is upheld by the principle of regular elections. So we have elections every 3 to 4 years, and that allows individuals to update their preferences and re-elect candidates if they've done a good job at representing their views, or re-elect a new candidate if they believe they are more better suited to their views and values. If politicians are not representative, then they may risk being not losing their seat and being kicked out of their seat at the next election. So this ensures that politicians are accountable to the people and must listen to our concerns. However, It may mean that politicians only cater to the most vocal and influential in society, or only consider the views of the majority, as they are more likely to correlate into votes and secure their politician seat at the next election. It also may lead to a lack of changes on controversial issues, because politicians don't want to alienate and lose some of their voters, because that may mean that they're not voted in at the next election. It may also lead to short-term policies and changes, as short-term policies with immediate changes secure votes, because people can say, well, they did a really good job, look how great this policy was. Whereas something that is promised, in 5 years' time to see the benefits doesn't actually correlate into real votes. And finally, representative government may mean that minority groups are overlooked because they do not make up a large proportion of votes, which is, discriminatory and disadvantageous for minority groups. The next factor that affects the ability of Parliament is political pressures. So political pressures may affect Parliament's ability to act, or it may prevent Parliament from acting in a certain way. There are 3 different types of political pressures. The first type is domestic political pressures. So political pressures come from members of the community to introduce bills which are representative of the community's concerns and values. Domestic pressures may also come from businesses and organisations through financial donations. The next type of political pressures is internal political pressures, and this is from within Parliament and within the political process. So there would be political pressures along members of Parliament to vote along party lines. The Liberal Party would put pressure on the Liberal members to vote along party lines and vote in accordance with the Liberal Party's views. There's also pressure placed on independents and minor political parties to support the larger parties when there is a minority government, and the larger political parties depend on those independents and minor political parties in order to gain a majority of votes. And there's also scrutiny and pressure from the upper house placed on the lower house to make amendments to bills through the House of Review process. The third type of political pressures are international pressures, and these are pressures from international organisations such as the UN, World Health Organization, or Amnesty International in regards to human rights issues, and they would put pressure on Australia to adhere to our international obligations and improve our adherence to international law. There's also political pressures from other countries that we trade with or are in defence agreements with, and pressures from global events such as coronavirus or terrorism that would encourage changes in our domestic law in order to reflect the current political climate throughout the globe. And finally, restrictions on Parliament. So this is all recapping things that we have learnt in the first area study of Unit 4. So Parliament must adhere to the division of powers. So Parliament can only, if it's a Commonwealth Parliament, they can only make laws in areas of exclusive and concurrent power. If it's the state Parliament, they can only make law in residual or concurrent. Parliament must also adhere to the separation of powers, so they can only exercise legislative powers, not judicial or executive. And if Parliament was to breach the division of separation of powers, then the High Court would declare that legislation invalid and ultra vires. The express rights also act as a restriction on Parliament. Parliament cannot make a law which infringes upon our 5 express rights. Section 109 acts as a restriction for state parliaments in areas of concurrent power, because if they are to pass a law which is inconsistent with a Commonwealth law, then the state law will be rendered invalid. Finally, the lawmaking process itself acts as a restriction on Parliament because there's so many formalities, in the sense that it has to go through a vote in both houses and then receive royal assent. And Parliament only sits for about 50 days per year. So there are significant time delays which act as a restriction on Parliament's ability to pass legislation. So that brings us to the end of the first video, and I hope to see you in the next one.